At 70 years old, after 42 years of marriage, Lenore Ashford received exactly what her husband believed she deserved: 2 suitcases of personal belongings and a thin envelope of cash. That was the sum of her life, according to the court. According to the man she had loved since she was 28. According to everyone who had watched and said nothing. But Colton Ashford had forgotten something. A small piece of land buried so deep in Lenore's past that it had never appeared on a single document in their marriage. A cabin in the mountains of Vermont that her mother had left behind. And that forgotten place, that overlooked inheritance, would make everything Colton had taken feel like loose change dropped on a sidewalk. If this story touches something real in you, subscribe to this channel and stay until the end. What happens next will change how you see the meaning of starting over. October moved through the streets of Montpellier like a slow exhale. The kind of autumn day where the sky hung low and the trees had already given up most of their color, leaving behind bare branches and scattered leaves that scraped across pavement in the wind. It was the kind of day that felt like an ending, even before anything had ended. Lenore Ashford stood on the front steps of the house on Birchwood Lane. Not inside the house. Not anymore. She stood on the steps like a visitor, her thin cardigan pulled tight across her chest, her hands gripping the edges of the fabric. Not because of the cold. She had lived through 70 Vermont autumns. She knew cold. This was something else. This was the kind of chill that started inside the ribs and worked its way outward, the kind no coat could stop. Behind her, the front door was propped open. 2 men in gray uniforms moved in and out, carrying boxes, lamps, picture frames, kitchen chairs. They worked quickly and without hesitation, the way people work when the objects they carry have no meaning to them. One of them held the wooden clock that had hung above the mantel for 30 years. He tucked it under his arm like a football and walked to the truck without looking back. Lenore watched him go. That clock had been a wedding gift from her sister, the one who had passed 6 years ago. The movers did not know that. They did not need to know. At the end of the walkway, parked along the curb, sat a dark sedan with fresh wax gleaming under the pale afternoon sun. The car looked expensive and out of place against the aging neighborhood, like a suit worn to a funeral that was not quite over. Leaning against it was Colton Ashford. He was 65, 5 years younger than Lenore, though he had always carried himself as though the gap were wider. Tall, clean-shaven, silver hair combed back from a forehead that had grown broader with the years. He wore a pressed shirt with the collar buttoned to the top, and every few seconds he adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve, a habit Lenore had noticed decades ago but never mentioned. It was the thing he did when he wanted to appear calm, but was not. He checked his watch. He shifted his weight. He looked at the movers, then at the house, then at the street, but never at Lenore. Not once. As though she had already left and he was simply waiting for the air to settle behind her. One of the movers came down the steps carrying the last box. He set it in the back of the truck, brushed his hands on his pants, and called out across the yard. "That's everything," Colton nodded. He reached beneath his arm and pulled out a manila folder, the same folder Lenore had seen every week for the past 3 months. Papers, signatures, court seals. Page by page, the machinery of divorce had done its work. 42 years of marriage reduced to a stack of documents thinner than a cookbook. Lenore stepped down one stair. Her voice came out softer than she intended, almost carried away by the wind before it reached him. "Colton, this isn't right." He exhaled. Not a sigh. Not sadness. Just the sound a man makes when he has heard a sentence he considers already answered. "Everything is finished, Lenore." His voice was flat, efficient. "The house is in my name." The court confirmed that. The accounts, the car, the insurance, all documented. She looked past his shoulder, through the open front door. The hallway wall where their wedding photograph had hung for 4 decades was bare now. A faint rectangle of lighter paint marked the spot, the ghost of a frame that had watched over every morning and every evening of their life together. The porch railing Colton had built the summer their daughter was born still stood at the edge of the steps, though one post had loosened over the years and leaned slightly to the left. She remembered the afternoon he built it. He had been 30, shirtless in the July heat, measuring each post with a care she had mistaken for love. Maybe it had been love then. Maybe it had been something else all along, something closer to ownership, to making sure everything around him looked the way he wanted it to look. 42 years, Lenore said. Colton adjusted his cuff. You should take your things and go. He gestured toward the curb. 2 suitcases sat on the sidewalk beside the mailbox, medium-sized, navy blue. The kind sold at discount stores, designed for weekend trips, not for holding an entire life. Lenore looked at them. Then she looked at Colton. My things, she repeated. That is what the court awarded you. Everything else is in my name. She searched his face. She was not looking for guilt or hesitation or love. She was looking for recognition. Some flicker of the man who had once driven 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring her roses on their anniversary because the local shop had closed early. Some sign that the person standing in front of her remembered what they had been. There was nothing. Only the flat composure of a man who had already closed a door inside himself and walked through to the other side. You'll be fine, Colton said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a white envelope. There's money in here. Enough for you to get settled somewhere. A facility. Assisted living. There are good ones south of Burlington. That word, facility. It landed harder than anything else he had said. Harder than the word divorce. Harder than the word finished. Because it told her exactly what she had become in his eyes. Not a wife. Not a partner. Not even a person with a future. Just a problem to be placed somewhere clean and managed. At your age, he continued, not unkindly, in the way a person speaks when they believe their cruelty is merely practical, you should be realistic about what comes next. Living alone isn't something you can manage. It never was. Lenore stared at his hand for a long time before she took the envelope. Her fingers felt numb when they touched the paper. Start where? She asked. That's up to you. He turned toward the car. The engine started so smoothly it barely made a sound. Colton opened the driver's door, paused for half a second as though remembering something, then sat inside without saying it. Take care of yourself, Lenore. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb. The sedan turned at the end of Birchwood Lane and disappeared behind the row of elms that had been there longer than either of them. There was no backward glance. No brake light. No moment of reconsideration. Lenore stood on the sidewalk, her 2 suitcases at her feet, the envelope in her hand. The street was empty now. The moving truck had gone. The house behind her still had its front door open, but it was no longer her door. The wind pushed a few dry leaves across the threshold as though even the season was entering without asking. Across the street, Mrs. Bellamy watched from behind her curtain. Lenore could see the fabric shift. They had lived on the same street for 26 years. Mrs. Bellamy had borrowed sugar from Lenore's kitchen more times than either of them could count. She had attended Lenore's daughter's high school graduation. She had brought casseroles when Lenore had the flu 2 winters ago. Now she stood behind her curtain and watched a woman she knew be erased from her own life. And she did not open her door. She did not come outside. She did not say a word. That silence was louder than anything Colton had said. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the weeks before, late at night, in the bathroom with the water running so Colton would not hear. There was nothing left in her now except a heavy blankness, the feeling of standing in a place that used to be yours and realizing it no longer recognizes you. She sat down on the edge of the curb. The concrete was rough through the thin fabric of her pants. She looked at the cracks in the sidewalk, at the weeds pushing through, and tried to hold on to something solid. Something the lawyers had not signed away. 42 years. She tried to remember when it had changed. Not the marriage itself, but the balance of it. There had been good years, real ones. Years when she believed the life they were building was shared equally. She remembered the first apartment in Burlington, before they moved to Birchwood Lane. A one-bedroom with a radiator that clanked all night, and a kitchen so small they had to take turns standing at the counter. She had been happy there. They both had, or so she thought. She remembered the day they drove to Montpellier to look at the house. Colton had walked through every room with a tape measure, writing numbers in a small notebook, calculating costs, assessing value. She had stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard, at the old maple tree near the fence, and thought about a child running across the grass. They had seen different things that day. She understood that now. The children came. 2 of them. A daughter, Elaine, who lived in Oregon now and called every other Sunday. A son, Mitchell, who lived in Boston and called when he remembered. Neither of them had been told about the divorce until after it was finalized. Colton had insisted on that. When Lenore finally called Elaine, her daughter had been silent for a long time before saying, "Do you need me to come?" Lenore had said no. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she did not want her children to see her with nothing. Mitchell had not called back. The years between the apartment and the curb had passed the way years pass when a person is busy being useful. She cooked, she cleaned, she raised children. She managed the house while Colton managed the money, a division he had proposed early and she had never questioned. She did not know the exact balance of their savings account. She did not know the details of the mortgage. She did not know that the house, which she had painted and maintained and filled with 42 years of living, had been put solely in his name during a refinancing she had signed without reading because he had told her it was routine. She trusted him. That was the simplest way to say it. She trusted him the way a person trusts the floor beneath their feet, not because she had tested it, but because it had always been there. Until it wasn't. Her hand slipped into her handbag. She was not looking for anything in particular, just reaching for something familiar, something untouched by court orders and red seals. Her fingers found something small and cold. She pulled it out. A brass key, old and worn, its edges smoothed by decades of handling. The teeth were shallow, the bow slightly bent. It was the kind of key that belonged to a lock no one made anymore. And with it came a memory. Not sudden, not sharp, but slow, rising like warmth from a stove that had been left on low. The smell of pine. Wind moving through trees. A voice calling from a porch. Her mother's voice. A place. A cabin in the Green Mountains. The place where her mother, Rosalind Calloway, had lived alone for the last 20 years of her life. A place Lenore had not visited since the funeral. A place whose deed was in her maiden name, recorded in a county office Colton had never set foot in. A place he did not know existed. Lenore's fingers closed around the key. She sat there for a long time, feeling its weight against her palm. Then, for the first time since the car had disappeared from sight, she lifted her head. Not toward the road ahead. Not toward the bus stop 2 blocks east. Toward somewhere else entirely. What she did not know then, what she could not have known, was that Colton Ashford had not simply taken the house and the car and the savings. He had planned the entire divorce 2 years in advance. She would discover this later, in pieces, the way a person discovers water damage in a wall. He had quietly transferred accounts. He had hired a lawyer months before telling her. He had renamed the joint savings under his own Social Security number while she was visiting her cousin in New Hampshire. Every document, every signature, every courtroom appearance had been arranged so that when the final papers were signed, Lenore would have nothing left to fight with and no money to hire someone who could fight for her. 42 years. And the man she had married had spent the last 2 of them building a cage around her future. But there was one thing he had not accounted for. One small piece of land buried in a name he had never bothered to learn. And that is where this story truly begins. The next morning, Lenore sat in the back row of an intercity bus heading northeast. Her 2 suitcases were wedged upright against her knees, her handbag resting on her lap. Outside the window, Montpellier slid away in pale gray streaks. Low rooftops, parking lots, gas stations. Then the buildings thinned and the trees thickened, and the road began to curve through hills that grew steeper with every mile. The driver did not talk. The other passengers did not either. A young man near the front wore headphones and stared at his phone. A woman with a sleeping toddler sat 3 rows ahead, her head leaning against the window. Each person carried a direction of their own, a reason for leaving wherever they had left. No one looked twice at the elderly woman sitting quietly with her thumb brushing the outline of a key inside her coat pocket. She transferred buses once in a town called Marshfield. The second bus was smaller, older, and smelled of diesel and vinyl seats patched with tape. It climbed through roads that narrowed as the elevation rose, winding between walls of birch and spruce, past farmhouses with smoke coming from their chimneys and mailboxes standing at the ends of long dirt driveways. The bus let her off at a stop that was nothing more than a metal sign on a wooden post at the edge of a 2-lane road. She stepped off into the cold, pulled her suitcases down after her, and watched the bus disappear around a bend. The driver had not asked where she was going. She had not told him. There was something both lonely and freeing about being a person no one expected anything from. Ahead of her, the paved road continued for about a quarter mile before it ended at a gravel turnaround. Beyond that, there was only a narrow dirt path running between thick stands of trees. Wild grass spilled over both sides, and the ruts in the dirt were deep enough to suggest that no vehicle had passed through in a long time. Lenore began walking. The small wheels of her suitcase caught on every root, every stone, every ridge of frozen mud. She had to stop several times to switch hands, to stretch her lower back, to catch her breath. The air here was different from anything she had breathed in months. Damp earth, pine resin, rotting leaves, and the sharp, clean cold that only exists deep in the woods at the end of autumn. The sound of the road behind her faded. In its place were branches brushing against one another overhead, the crunch of dry leaves under her shoes, and her own breathing, steady but labored. She walked for nearly 45 minutes. More than once she stopped and looked behind her, at the path stretching longer with every step, and wondered whether she had taken the wrong way. 40 years was enough for a place to change. Memory had a way of repainting everything in warmer colors than reality. Twice she thought she had missed the turn. Once she sat on a fallen log and rested, her breath visible in the cold air, and considered the possibility that the cabin was gone. That time had taken it the way time takes everything that is not maintained. But then the trees thinned. The path curved to the left, and through the gap in the birches, she saw it. The cabin was still there, smaller than she remembered. The wooden walls had darkened with rain and sun to a color between charcoal and ash. The roof sagged at one corner, and the old porch railing was coated in a layer of dust and thin moss. One of the front windows had a crack running diagonally from corner to corner, and the steps leading up to the door were covered in a mat of dead leaves that had accumulated over years, not seasons. But it stood. It stood the way old things stand when they have been built to endure rather than to impress. Not proudly, not beautifully, but firmly, quietly. Lenore stopped a few paces from the porch. She did not go forward right away. She stood there, both suitcases at her sides, and looked. The thin curtain at the left window was still hanging, gray with dust. The wooden chair where her mother used to sit on summer afternoons still leaned against the wall, one leg tilted slightly. A cracked clay pot rested beneath the porch railing, empty for years. The smell reached her before she reached the door. Mold, and old wood, and mouse droppings, and something else, something organic and ancient. The smell of a place that had been sealed too long and forgotten by everyone except the weather. She pulled her suitcases up the first step. The wood groaned softly beneath the weight. The second step. The third. In front of her was the old door with its tarnished brass lock. She took the key from her pocket, looked at it, pressed it into the lock. At first, the key would not turn. She tried again, more slowly, pressing deeper. A dry sound. Then the bolt shifted. The door opened with a long creak that echoed through the empty room beyond. Inside, it was darker than she expected. Not a heavy darkness, but the kind of dim, suspended light that forms behind windows no one has cleaned in years. The air was cool and thick with the smell of old wood, closed spaces, and something faintly sweet, like dried herbs left in a drawer too long. Lenore set her suitcases inside the door and stood still. She let her eyes adjust. Then she stepped in. Everything was almost exactly where it had always been. The wooden table in the center of the main room, covered with a white cloth that had yellowed with time. The small chairs arranged near the fireplace. The low bookshelf against the wall, still holding empty glass jars and a few cloth-bound books. The gray stone fireplace with a stack of firewood piled neatly beside it, as though someone had once intended to light a fire on some evening and then changed their mind. Or perhaps as though someone had known that one day someone else would need that fire more. She walked slowly through the room, her fingertips brushing the tabletop, the backs of the chairs, the edge of the mantel. In the small kitchen behind it, the hanging rack for pots still held 2 copper-bottomed pans. The porcelain sink was stained with mineral deposits. The wooden cabinet door hung slightly open, warped from years of humidity. She opened each drawer. A few porcelain plates, chipped at the edges but usable. Tablecloths folded neatly, smelling of cedar. An old box of matches, damp with age. A bottle of oil in the lowest corner, its label faded to nothing. There was nothing valuable here in the way Colton understood value. No silver, no documents, no expensive possessions. Only things carefully kept by someone who had always believed that objects were meant to serve life, not to be displayed. At the end of the narrow hallway was the small bedroom. The bedspread was still in place, faded blue cotton, covered with a thin layer of dust but clean beneath it. A patchwork quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed, each square stitched from different fabric, some from old dresses, some from curtains, some from clothes that had belonged to people Lenore could no longer name. On the wall above the bed hung an embroidered frame of wildflowers, purple clover and goldenrod and black-eyed Susans, made by Rosalind during the last winter she lived here. The stitches were even and careful, the colors still bright despite the years. Lenore touched the edge of the frame. She remembered watching her mother work on it, sitting in the chair by the fireplace, the needle moving in and out of the cloth with a patience that seemed endless. She had been 12 then, visiting during Christmas break, and the cabin had seemed enormous and warm, and full of the kind of safety that comes from being in a place where someone is paying attention to you. Now the room was small and cold, and the safety was gone. But the frame was still on the wall. The quilt was still on the bed. The things her mother had made with her hands were still here, waiting for hands that needed them. In the corner of the room, beside the foot of the wardrobe, sat a wooden trunk. She noticed it but did not open it. Not tonight. Tonight, there was only enough energy left to shake the dust from the bedspread, pull the quilt over herself, and lie down in the bed where her mother had slept for 20 years. The mattress sagged in the middle. The pillow smelled like cedar and old linen and something she could not name but recognized anyway. It smelled like the past, like the part of the past that had been good. She lay there in the dark, listening to the wind outside, to the creak of the roof, to the drip of water somewhere she could not see. Through the window, the trees stood black against a sky that held no stars, only clouds thick enough to press the darkness closer. She thought about Colton in his sedan, driving back to a house that was now his alone. She wondered whether he would eat dinner at the kitchen table they had shared for decades, or whether he would eat standing at the counter, the way people eat when there is no one to sit across from. She wondered whether he would notice the empty spaces on the walls, the missing clock, the absent weight of another person in the rooms. Then she stopped wondering, because it no longer mattered. And that night, lying on a narrow bed in a cabin that smelled of dust and silence and the memory of a woman who had once made this place a home, Lenore made a decision that would change everything. But first, she had to survive until morning. The first week was about survival in its most basic form. Lenore woke before dawn each morning. Not by choice, but because the cold would not let her sleep past 5. The space heater she bought at the hardware store in Harwick, the nearest town 7 miles down the mountain road, cost $38, nearly a quarter of what was left in the envelope after the bus tickets. The heater could only warm a circle about 6 feet wide. She learned to do everything within that circle: dress, eat, plan. The cabin's roof leaked in 3 places. She discovered this on the second night, when she woke to water dripping onto the quilt. By morning, she had positioned every container she owned beneath the drips. 2 pots from the kitchen, a plastic bucket she found in the shed, an old coffee can from the back of a cabinet. The rhythm of water hitting metal became the soundtrack of her nights. During the days, she cleaned. She stripped the dust covers from the table and chairs, carried them outside, shook them until her arms ached. She swept every corner of the cabin with a broom she found leaning behind the bedroom door, its bristles stiff and flattened from years of standing in the same position. She gathered cobwebs from the hallway ceiling, dry leaves from the kitchen floor, and mouse droppings from beneath the sink. She found a nest of mice behind the stove and moved it into the woods with a piece of cardboard and a pot lid. Not out of charity, but because she did not have the energy to deal with the alternative. Her back began to protest on the 3rd day. The dull ache that had been her companion for the past decade became something sharper, more insistent, every time she bent down or reached overhead. Her knees stiffened when she stood up too quickly. She had to stop between tasks, sit on the porch steps, wait for the pain to settle back to its usual low presence before picking up the broom again. She took the 2 pills she had brought with her each morning, the ones prescribed for the arthritis that had been settling into her joints for years. She had enough for 3 months. After that, she did not know. She did not work fast. She simply did not stop. Her meals were small and careful. A can of soup heated on the 2 burners that still worked. Day-old bread from the general store bought at a discount. Peanut butter from a jar she had packed in her suitcase, the only luxury she had thought to bring. She kept a notebook of expenses. Every dollar, every cent. The numbers were not encouraging. At this rate, her money would last 6 weeks if nothing else broke. By the end of the first week, the floorboards showed a lighter color beneath the swept-away grime. Sunlight slanted through the front window and cast a long strip across the table. The kitchen sink was scrubbed clean enough to use. The glass jars on the shelf near the fireplace were washed, dried, and lined up in a row. The town of Harwick watched her the way small towns watch anything unfamiliar. When she walked into the general store to buy sugar, matches, and a bundle of cheap candles, the man behind the counter looked at her a beat too long. When she asked for roof sealant at the hardware store, the woman at the register glanced at her hands, at her age, and said nothing, but the silence carried its own commentary. At the diner on Main Street, where she stopped once for a cup of coffee she could barely afford, 2 women at the next table spoke in voices just low enough to be deliberate. Something about the cabin. Something about a woman that age, alone. No one asked her name. No one asked where she had come from. They simply watched and waited, the way people wait for a storm to pass or a stray animal to move on. Lenore felt their eyes. She did not explain herself. She bought what she needed, carried it back up the mountain path in a canvas bag that dug into her shoulder and kept working. The roof was the hardest. She watched a video on her phone about patching leaks. The signal in the cabin was weak, and the video buffered every 30 seconds. So she watched the same 3-minute tutorial over the course of an entire afternoon, memorizing each step while the screen froze and reloaded and froze again. The first attempt failed. She mixed the sealant wrong and it peeled away overnight. The second attempt held for 2 days before a gust of wind lifted the edge and water came through again. The third attempt, using a method she had modified after the 2 failures, combining the sealant with a strip of heavy plastic she cut from a feed bag she found in the shed, held. She stood beneath the repaired section that evening, looking up, waiting for the drip that did not come. It was such a small victory. A patch of plastic and sealant on an old roof in the middle of nowhere. But it felt like proof. Proof that she could learn something and make it work. proof that failure was not permanent unless she let it be. Her hands changed that month. The palms that had spent 42 years doing housework, folding laundry, arranging flowers, writing grocery lists, became something else. Calloused, cracked at the knuckles, stained with wood sealant that would not wash off no matter how hard she scrubbed. She looked at them one evening by the light of the fireplace and did not recognize them as her own. They were different hands now. Hands that had learned something. What would you do if you were in her place? Would you keep going, or would you walk away? Tell me in the comments below, and keep watching, because what she does next will surprise everyone who underestimated her. In the middle of November, the first real storm arrived. It came without much warning. The sky darkened by 3 in the afternoon, and by 5 the wind was throwing itself against the cabin walls with a force that made the windows rattle in their frames. Snow came sideways, thick and fast, piling against the porch railing and sealing the cracks beneath the front door with a white line that grew wider by the hour. Lenore stacked firewood beside the hearth and fed the flames carefully. She boiled water in the old kettle. She wrapped herself in every blanket she had and sat in the chair closest to the fire, listening to the wind tear through the trees outside. The cabin creaked and groaned around her like a ship in rough water. She could feel the cold coming through the floorboards, through the walls where the insulation had thinned, through the window frames she had not yet sealed. She pulled the blanket tighter. She fed the fire another log. She waited. At some point past midnight, a sound woke her. Not the wind, something sharper. A crack, followed by a heavy thud on the roof. A branch or a section of the old gutter giving way. Then the dripping started. Not in the 3 places she had already patched. In a new place, directly above the kitchen, where the ceiling boards were oldest. Water came through fast. It pooled on the kitchen counter, ran across the floor, and soaked the 2 small jars of apple preserves she had managed to make from the fruit of the gnarled tree behind the cabin. Her first real attempt at making something. The jars did not break, but the labels she had written by hand dissolved into wet pulp, and the lids rusted where the water sat. Lenore stood in the middle of the kitchen floor in the dark, the water cold around her shoes, her back locked in a spasm that made it impossible to straighten fully. The space heater hummed uselessly from the other room. The fire was dying. The wind screamed. And for the first time since leaving Montpellier, she cried. Not the quiet, controlled crying she had done in the bathroom of the house on Birchwood Lane. This was different. This was the kind of crying that comes when a person has used up everything they have, and there is nothing left to bargain with. She sat down on the wet floor, her back against the cabinet, and cried until her chest hurt and her eyes burned, and the only sound left was the water dripping into the puddle beside her. She did not cry about Colton. She did not cry about the house or the money or the 42 years. She cried because a small voice inside her, the voice she had been fighting since the day she arrived, whispered that maybe he was right. Maybe she could not do this. Maybe she was too old, too tired, too broken to live alone in a cabin in the mountains in the middle of winter. Maybe the facility was where she belonged. That voice was the cruelest thing she had heard in months. Crueler than anything Colton had said, because it came from inside. She sat on that floor for a long time. The water pooled around her. The cold pressed through her clothes. Her back ached so deeply she could feel it in her teeth. And for one long, terrible moment, she considered standing up, packing her 2 suitcases, walking back down the mountain path, and finding the nearest phone to call Colton and tell him he was right. That moment lasted about 30 seconds. Then it passed. Not because something dramatic happened. Not because she found sudden strength or heard an encouraging voice. It passed because she was simply too stubborn to let it stay. Then morning came. The snow had stopped. The wind had settled into something quieter, almost apologetic. Pale sunlight crept through the kitchen window and lit up the puddle on the floor, turning it into a small mirror that reflected the ceiling beams above. Lenore was still sitting against the cabinet. Her back had loosened enough to let her stand, though it took her 3 tries. She looked at the mess. The wet floor, the ruined labels, the dark stains spreading across the ceiling where the water had come through. She was still looking at it when she heard the sound of a truck engine outside. Delia Pruitt's pickup came around the last bend in the dirt path at 8 in the morning, its tires cutting fresh tracks through the snow. Delia was 48, built solid, with short brown hair tucked under a wool cap and hands that looked like they had been shaking hands with pipe wrenches since childhood. She ran a small plumbing business out of her garage and drove the mountain roads most days, checking on clients scattered through the hills. She had first stopped at the cabin 10 days earlier, when she noticed the thin trail of smoke coming from the chimney of a place she had assumed was abandoned. She had knocked on the door, found Lenore inside trying to stop a leak beneath the kitchen sink with a dish towel and a prayer, and had fixed the pipe in 20 minutes without being asked. She had not said much that day, just fixed the pipe, tested the water, and told Lenore to get proper pipe tape from the hardware store. But something had passed between them in that short visit. Something that does not need words. The recognition of one woman who had been left behind by another who understood what that felt like. Delia had a daughter, 12 years old, named Cassie. Delia's husband had left 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not with shouting or lawyers. He had simply gone to the store one Saturday and not come back. For 6 months, Delia had told Cassie he was working. Then she stopped, because Cassie had already figured it out, the way children always do. Now Delia stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the ceiling stain, the puddle, and Lenore's face. She did not say anything about the redness around Lenore's eyes. She did not say anything about the blanket still draped over her shoulders, or the way she was holding her lower back with one hand. Roof gave out? Above the kitchen. You got coffee? I have hot water and instant. That'll do. They drank instant coffee from mismatched cups while Delia examined the damage. Then, without discussion, without negotiation, Delia went to her truck and came back with a tarp, a hammer, nails, and a tube of industrial sealant. She climbed onto the roof while Lenore held the ladder steady from below, her hands white-knuckled against the cold aluminum. It took most of the day. Delia did not talk much while she worked. Neither did Lenore. But there was something in the silence between them that was not empty. It was the silence of two people who understood what it meant to be left behind and to keep moving anyway. At one point during the afternoon, while they sat on the porch eating crackers and drinking more instant coffee, Delia said, without looking up, "My daughter asked me the other day if I ever get lonely up here on the mountain roads." Lenore waited. "I told her the roads aren't lonely. They're just quiet. There's a difference." She did not say anything else about it, but Lenore understood. By late afternoon, the roof was patched. The kitchen floor was mopped. The fire was rebuilt. Delia stood on the porch, pulling her gloves back on. "You got someone who can help you with this place regular?" "No. You should." Delia adjusted her cap. "I come up this way Tuesdays and Fridays. If something breaks, leave a rag on the porch rail and I'll stop." She did not wait for a thank you. She got in her truck and drove away, the taillights disappearing around the bend like two small red eyes closing. Lenore stood on the repaired porch and watched the empty road for a long time. Then she went inside, pulled a chair close to the fire, and sat down. She was not the same woman who had sat on the curb outside the house on Birchwood Lane. She was not sure who she was becoming, but she knew one thing. She was not going to a facility. She was not going anywhere. When she cleaned up the remaining debris the following day, pulling wet leaves and broken bark from the corner of the bedroom, she dragged out the wooden trunk from beside the wardrobe. She had noticed it before but had not opened it. There had been too many other things to do, too many leaks to fix, too many hours spent simply trying to stay warm. Now she knelt beside it. The hinges were stiff but still worked. She lifted the lid. Inside were not old clothes or scattered photographs. There were notebooks, dozens of them, stacked in careful piles, their covers made of brown, blue, and gray cloth. Each one had handwriting on the spine, her mother's handwriting, steady and slightly slanted to the right. Summer gardening, preserving herbs, kitchen miscellaneous notes, seasonal planting guide, bread and pastry. Lenore lifted the top notebook and sat on the edge of the bed. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was clear, unhurried, written by someone who believed that every word deserved the time it took to form it properly. Plum jam should be cooked over low heat longer than one thinks. Not so the fruit softens fully, but so the sugar learns how to stay. She turned more pages. Instructions for drying apples in thin slices on a wooden rack near the window, the kind of rack she had seen leaning against the wall of the shed. A method for keeping the scent of mint leaves through the winter by pressing them between layers of wax paper. Notes on when to plant beans, just as the soil turned warm, and why seeds started too early would grow weak and leggy. Between the practical entries were short lines about the weather, about the color of the sky at dusk, about how nothing still useful should ever be thrown away. The kitchen is like life. Not everything can be used at the same time. One notebook contained nothing but bread recipes. Sourdough with notes in the margin about how the starter should smell, like overripe fruit and warm stone. Rye bread with a warning that the dough would feel wrong, heavy and sticky, and that this was exactly right. Cornbread with the note, "This one your father loved. I made it every Sunday until the last one." Another notebook recorded the wild plants of the forest. Which leaves eased a sore throat when steeped in hot water. Which bark could be boiled into a compress for muscle pain. Which berries were safe and which looked safe but were not, with small pencil drawings to show the difference. At the bottom of one page, Rosalind had written, "The forest gives you what you need, but only if you learn to ask properly." These were not simply recipes. They were not simply gardening tips. They were a complete system for living. A blueprint for self-sufficiency written in the hand of a woman who had done it alone, in this very cabin, for 20 years. And then, in the back of a gray notebook, tucked between the last page and the cover, she found the letter. It was written on a single sheet of paper, folded twice, the edges soft from age. The handwriting was the same, but smaller, more deliberate, as though these words had been chosen more carefully than any recipe. It was addressed to Lenore. "My dear girl, if you are reading this, then you have come back. I always believed you would, though I hoped it would be under happier circumstances. This land is yours. It has always been yours. I put it in the name you were born with, the name you carried before anyone else claimed you. No one can take it. No one can sign it away. It belongs to you the way your own hands belong to you." Lenore stopped reading. Her vision blurred. She blinked, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and continued. "I know what it is to start again. I did it here, in this cabin, when I was 45 years old and your father had gone. I know the fear. I know the voice that tells you it is too late. That voice is a liar. It has always been a liar. The land will feed you if you feed it. The kitchen will sustain you if you use it. And the people who pass through, the ones who stop and stay a moment, they will become your proof that a life built by hand is worth more than anything built on paper." The letter ended with a single line. "Do not let anyone tell you what you cannot carry." Lenore held the paper against her chest. Her mother had walked this same path, had sat in this same room, had faced the same silence, the same fear, the same voice that said it was too late. And she had answered it not with words, but with decades of living, with jars of jam and rows of vegetables and notebooks filled with everything she had learned, with a life that proved the voice wrong every single day it continued. Lenore set the letter on the bedside table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to the kitchen, and opened the first notebook to the recipe for sourdough bread. She would start in the morning. If you're still here, thank you. The best part of this story is coming. Hit that like button so this story can reach someone else who needs to hear it. Now let me tell you what she built. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm that became as steady as breathing. In the morning, Lenore lit the fire, mixed dough following the instructions in the bread notebook, and waited for the yeast to rise. At midday, she worked outside, clearing the old vegetable beds behind the cabin, pulling dead grass, turning soil with a hoe she had found in the shed and cleaned with a damp rag. In the afternoon, she stood in the kitchen, watching jam simmer on the stove, washing jars, twisting on lids, writing dates on paper labels in her own handwriting. In the evenings, she read the notebooks. She read about strawberry jam and how the ripest fruit should be used first, the firmer berries saved for the next batch. She read about drying rosemary without losing its scent, about elderberry syrup, about sourdough starters that needed 3 days of patience before they were ready. She read about life, about how her mother had lived it, about how she could live it too. By late January, she had made her first loaf of bread. Dense, slightly lopsided, with a crust that was harder than it should have been. But when she broke it open, the inside was warm and soft and smelled like something that belonged in a kitchen. She ate half of it that evening with a thin layer of apple butter she had found in the back of the cabinet, still sealed, still good. The other half she wrapped in cloth and set on the counter. It was the first thing she had made with her own hands that she wanted to keep. By February, she had 3 jars of apple cinnamon jam cooling on the kitchen shelf, each one sealed with wax the way Rosalind's notes described. The first batch had been too sweet. The second had not set properly. The third was right. She knew it was right because she tasted it and closed her eyes and could almost hear her mother saying, "Now you understand. Not because you followed the instructions, but because you learned why the instructions work." By March, the snow had begun to recede, and the first green shoots appeared in the garden beds she had cleared. She placed an old wooden crate near the edge of the dirt road, about 20 steps from the cabin. On it were 3 jars of jam, 2 small loaves of bread, a bundle of sage tied with string, and a hand-lettered sign in black ink. Homemade goods. Put money in the tin box. She did not stand beside the table. She sat on the porch with a notebook in her hand, occasionally looking up across the yard. The first day, nobody came until nearly 11. A middle-aged man in a hunting jacket stepped out of an old truck, picked up a jar of jam, turned it in his hands, and looked toward the cabin. Lenore stayed where she was. He dropped 2 bills into the tin box and drove away without a word. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote the first line beneath a heading she had started that morning. Early spring. Prepare ahead. She wrote the number beside each item that had sold, then added them up slowly with the tip of her pen. $4. It was not much. But she had made something, set it out for the world, and someone had found it worth paying for. That small fact carried more weight than she could explain. The next week, she added more bread to the table. The week after, bundles of dried thyme and sage. She learned to notice patterns. Friday mornings drew more traffic. Tuesdays were quieter. People who stopped once usually stopped again if they liked what they found. A woman who worked at a clinic 12 miles away began stopping every Thursday for plum jam and herbal tea. She told Lenore the tea helped her sleep. Lenore did not know whether that was true, but she dried an extra bundle each week and set it aside. An elderly man named Harmon, who lived alone 2 miles down the mountain, began walking up on Saturday mornings for bread. He never said much. He paid, nodded, and walked back. But one morning, after weeks of this routine, he paused at the edge of the clearing and said, without turning around, "Your bread is better than what they sell in town. I thought you should know that." Lenore stood on the porch holding the dollar bills he had left and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt seen, not looked at, not watched, not evaluated or judged or managed. Seen. In the simple, honest way that happens when a person makes something with their hands and another person recognizes the care in it. And then something else happened. While digging a new row for beans behind the cabin, her shovel hit something hard. Not a rock. Something deeper. Water began to seep up through the soil, clear and faintly mineral-scented. She knelt down and touched it. Cold. Clean. with a taste like wet stone and iron. That night, she went back to the notebooks. Near the back of the gray notebook, in a section marked Land Notes, she found a short entry in smaller handwriting. The spring behind the house. Keep this to yourself. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just that one line, underlined twice. Lenore did not understand its significance. Not yet. But she brought a sample of the water to town the following week, in a glass jar with a handwritten label. That is how she met Nora Clement. Nora was 55, the head librarian and unofficial keeper of local records at the Harwick Public Library, a one-story brick building on Main Street that also served as the town's historical archive. She had wire-rimmed glasses, a quiet voice, and the kind of patience that comes from spending decades helping people find things they did not know they were looking for. When Lenore explained what she had found, Nora did not react immediately. She took the jar, looked at the water, asked a few questions about the location, and then disappeared into the back room for 20 minutes. She came back carrying a folder of county land records. Over the next 3 visits, spaced across 2 weeks, Nora helped Lenore trace the history of the property. On the first visit, Nora found the deed and the name. On the second, she found the mineral rights filing, buried in a sub-document from 1962. On the third, she cross-referenced the filing with state geological surveys and confirmed that the spring matched the description in the original claim. The deed was recorded in the name Lenore Calloway, her maiden name, registered before her marriage. It had never been transferred, never contested, never mentioned in any divorce proceeding. On the third visit, Nora sat back in her chair and looked at Lenore over the top of her glasses. "Mrs. Ashford, do you understand what you have here?" Lenore shook her head. "This is a registered natural spring with certified mineral content. The rights were filed 60 years ago and never developed, never canceled, never transferred. If these records are accurate, and I believe they are, you are sitting on something that has real, substantial value. Water rights in Vermont are not something people overlook anymore." "How much value?" Nora removed her glasses and cleaned them with a cloth, taking her time. "I am not an appraiser, but I can tell you this. There are companies that would pay significant money for access to a natural spring with this mineral profile. We are not talking about thousands. We are talking about the kind of number that makes people hire lawyers." Lenore looked at the jar of water sitting on the library table. Clear. Still. Ordinary looking. She thought about Colton, about the house on Birchwood Lane, about the sedan and the manila folder and the word facility. She thought about all the things he had taken and how carefully he had planned the taking. And she thought about this jar of water on a library table in a town he had never heard of, worth more than all of it combined. She thought about her mother, who had known, who had kept the secret, who had written one line in a notebook and underlined it twice. Did you expect that? Neither did she. If this moment gave you chills, let me know in the comments. Just one word. How do you feel right now? But Lenore did not rush. She did not call a lawyer that afternoon. She went back to the cabin, sat on the porch steps, and opened her mother's letter again. "The land will feed you if you feed it." She folded the letter back into the notebook and went inside to start dinner. Because the spring was not the point. It was part of the safety her mother had built into this place. But it was not why Lenore stayed. She stayed because for the first time in 42 years, she was building something that belonged to her, not to a marriage, not to a name on a document, to her. And she was not finished. Spring arrived slowly in the Green Mountains. The frost let go of the ground 1 inch at a time, and the first warmth came not from the sun but from beneath the soil, where the roots of things that had survived the winter were beginning to push upward again. Lenore planted beans, scallions, thyme, mustard greens, marigolds to keep the pests away, and a row of mint along the fence. She used the planting guide from her mother's notebooks, adjusting for the things that had changed. She worked on her knees in the mornings when the ground was still soft from the overnight dew, and she stood up slowly each time, pressing her hands against her lower back, waiting for the stiffness to ease. It was slow work, but it was hers. Boyd Kessler appeared in April. He was 61, tall and thin, with a gray beard and hands that moved with the deliberate care of someone who had spent decades handling knives and hot pans. He had been the head chef at a restaurant in Montpellier for 18 years, before walking out one afternoon and never going back. Burnout, he called it later, though at the time he had no word for it. He had been driving the back roads of Vermont for 6 months, doing nothing in particular, eating at diners, sleeping at motels, wondering whether the thing he had loved for 30 years had been destroyed by the people who paid him to do it. He found Lenore's roadside stand on a Tuesday. By then, the stand had grown from a single wooden crate to a proper table with a clean cloth, 6 jars of jam, 2 loaves of bread, and a bundle of dried sage. He picked up a jar of plum jam, removed the lid, and smelled it. Then he looked toward the cabin. "Who made this?" "I did," Lenore answered from the porch. He bought 2 jars, the bread and the sage. He came back the following Friday. On the 3rd visit, he asked whether she would show him the recipe. Lenore did not show him the recipe. She showed him the notebook. Boyd sat at the kitchen table for an hour, turning pages, reading entries, occasionally stopping to close his eyes the way a person does when they are tasting something in their memory. When he finished, he looked up. Your mother was not just a cook. She was a teacher. She would have liked hearing that. Boyd began stopping by regularly. He suggested small improvements. Better labels, written with cleaner letters and sealed with tape to keep the ink from running. A second variety of jam using wild berries from the hillside. A way of slicing bread so each loaf looked more even on the table. He did not take over. He did not try to turn the cabin into a restaurant. He simply offered what he knew, and Lenore accepted what she could use. In return, the cabin gave him something he had lost. A kitchen where food was made with care, not pressure. Where the pace was set by the season, not by a ticket printer. Where the work mattered because the person doing it had chosen it freely. By May, the roadside stand was drawing regular visitors. A young woman named Sherilyn, who was opening a weekend market in Harwick, asked whether Lenore wanted to send goods down to town. A restaurant owner from Montpellier named Dennis Garreau drove up one afternoon after hearing about the jam from a supplier. He tasted 3 varieties and ordered 30 jars of blueberry jam for his seasonal menu. An elderly couple from a neighboring town brought seedlings of basil and oregano, saying the soil got enough sun for herbs. Lenore did not accept everything at once. She measured her own strength. She looked at the kitchen, at the number of empty jars, at the size of the vegetable beds, and at what she could maintain without breaking the rhythm she had built. She agreed to some of it. She said, "Not yet," to the rest. Each time there was a new possibility, she opened her mother's notebooks and searched for guidance, as though Rosalind were still standing somewhere in that narrow kitchen, reminding her that anything done by hand also had to remain within the limits of those hands. Her own notebook had grown thick. It was no longer just her mother's words copied in new ink. It was her own. Her observations, her adjustments, her records of what sold and what did not, what grew well and what struggled, what the weather did and how the soil responded. On the front porch, 4 mismatched chairs sat against the wall for customers who wanted tea. The tin box was replaced by a wooden box with a sliding lid that Boyd had made from scrap lumber. On the wall beside the front door, Lenore hung a small board listing the week's tasks. Everything had its place. Everything had its rhythm. Nora Clement had introduced her to Judson Holt. He was 63, semi-retired, a property and land use attorney who had spent 30 years handling disputes over wells, boundaries, timber rights, and mineral claims in the Green Mountains. He had a slow way of speaking and a habit of reading documents twice before saying anything about them. Judson confirmed what Nora had found. The land deed was solid. The mineral rights were valid. The spring was real and documented. Nothing about the property had ever been part of the marital estate. "If anyone comes asking," Judson said, folding his glasses into his shirt pocket, "you have nothing to worry about. This land has been in your name since before you were married. No court in Vermont would touch it." Lenore thanked him. She offered him a jar of jam. He accepted it with the seriousness of a man receiving a legal retainer. And for a few weeks, everything was good. The garden grew. The jam sold. The cabin no longer looked like a forgotten place. It looked like a place someone had chosen. But Lenore did not know that word about her had already traveled beyond Harwick. Stories like hers moved the way useful things always move in small towns. Quietly. From one person to the next. Until they reached someone who was listening for exactly that kind of information. On a Friday afternoon in early June, Delia came up the dirt road with a look on her face that Lenore had not seen before. "There's a man been asking about you in Harwick. Came into the general store yesterday. Drove a dark sedan. Told Frank at the counter he was looking for his ex-wife." Lenore's hands went still over the jar she was labeling. "What did Frank tell him?" "Nothing. Frank doesn't talk to strangers about his customers. But the man asked around at the diner too, and at the gas station." Lenore looked out at the road. The late afternoon sun was warm on the porch boards, and the air smelled like thyme and cut grass and the faintest hint of rain from the west. It was the kind of afternoon she had learned to love. The kind she had earned. "I know who it is," she said. Delia watched her for a moment. "You want me to do anything about it?" "No." Lenore picked up the jar, pressed the label flat, and set it in line with the others. "I've been waiting for this," she said. "I just didn't know when." We are approaching the moment everything changes. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You do not want to miss what happens next. Colton Ashford arrived at the end of July. He did not come unannounced. Word reached Lenore through 3 different people before his car appeared on the dirt road. The gas station attendant had called Delia, who called Boyd, who drove up to the cabin that morning. "He's been asking about the land," Boyd said. "About what it's worth. He hired a lawyer from Burlington. They filed a request with the county office asking for a review of the property records." "I know, Judson told me." Boyd hesitated before continuing. "There's something else. The people he talked to said he mentioned selling the house on Birchwood Lane. Something about the taxes and the upkeep being more than he'd planned. The man at the gas station said he looked like someone who'd been carrying bad news for a while." Lenore was standing at the kitchen counter, cutting apples for the next batch of preserves. She did not stop cutting. "Are you worried?" Boyd asked. "No." "Are you sure?" Lenore set the knife down and looked at him. "I have been worried for 42 years. About saying the wrong thing. About not being enough. About what he would think if I disagreed or complained or wanted something different. I spent 4 decades being worried." She picked the knife back up. "I'm done." The sedan appeared on the dirt road at 2 in the afternoon. It moved slowly over the ruts and stones, its dark paint collecting dust, its clean lines completely out of place against the wild grass and the tree line, and the hand-painted sign at the edge of the clearing. Colton stepped out and stood beside the car. He looked at the garden first. The rows of vegetables, the climbing beans covering the fence, the mint spilling over the edges of 2 clay pots. Then the porch, the 4 chairs, the bundles of herbs hanging upside down beneath the roof, the wooden table covered in a clean cloth with jars arranged in careful rows. Then he looked at Lenore. She was standing beside the table, both hands resting on the edge of the cloth. She did not smile. She did not wave. She did not move toward him. "Lenore," he said. "Colton." He took a few steps forward, then stopped at the edge of the clearing, as though he sensed a boundary he could not see. "I heard about this place. I didn't expect it to be like this." "You never thought about it." He adjusted his cuff. "I suppose that's true. I came because I heard what people are saying about this property, about what's on it." "You mean the spring?" "I mean the water rights, the mineral claim." Lenore picked up a dry leaf the wind had blown onto the table and set it into the clay pot beside the steps. "That is not why I live here, Colton." "That may be true. but my attorney believes there is a reasonable case that the property should have been included in the marital estate. Your attorney is wrong. The deed was recorded during our marriage. The deed is in my maiden name. The inheritance predates our marriage by 3 years. Judson Holt has already confirmed this with the county. Colton's jaw tightened. He had not expected her to have a lawyer. He had not expected her to have answers. He had expected the woman who had stood on the curb in October, trembling, holding an envelope, unable to argue. That woman was not here. But Colton did not leave. Over the following weeks, he tried other approaches. He contacted Dennis Garreau, the restaurant owner who bought Lenore's jam in bulk, suggesting the supplier was unreliable, that the woman was elderly and unpredictable, that the product might not be consistent. Dennis called Lenore that afternoon. He told her he had no intention of changing suppliers. He also told her, with the blunt honesty of a man who had been in the business for 20 years, that anyone who tried to undermine a 70-year-old woman's jam business was not someone whose opinion he valued. Colton visited the county clerk's office twice, requesting reviews, filings, anything that might open a crack in the property records. Each time, Judson's paperwork held firm. Then Colton tried something else. He began telling people in Harwick that Lenore was not well, that she was confused, that a woman her age, living alone in the woods, was not capable of managing property or finances. He used the word guardianship in a conversation at the Harwick diner, loud enough for 3 other tables to hear. That word traveled fast, but it did not travel the way Colton intended, because the people of Harwick had been buying Lenore's bread for months. They had sat on her porch and drunk tea from mismatched cups. They had watched her repair a cabin that everyone had assumed was beyond saving. They had watched her plant a garden, build a business, and stand in her kitchen at dawn making jam with the kind of concentration that does not come from confusion. It comes from purpose. When the diner owner heard what Colton had said, she repeated it to Delia. Delia repeated it to Boyd. Boyd repeated it to Nora. And Nora walked into the county courthouse the following morning and filed a formal statement confirming the validity of the property records and the competence of the property owner. She added a personal note. I have worked with Mrs. Ashford over several months. She is clear-minded, organized, and fully capable of managing her own affairs. Any suggestion to the contrary is without merit. By the end of the week, Colton's efforts had not weakened Lenore's position. They had strengthened it. Judson called Lenore on a Tuesday evening. He's not going to stop on his own. His attorney filed another motion. It won't succeed, but it'll cost you time and energy. I think it's time to settle this face-to-face. Lenore stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the garden. The apple tree was heavy with fruit. The evening light was gold and low, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look important. Where? The town hall in Harwick. I've already spoken with his attorney. They agreed to a meeting next Thursday. All right. She hung up the phone, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened her mother's notebook to the page with the letter. She read it one last time. Do not let anyone tell you what you cannot carry. She closed the notebook, placed her hand flat on the cover, and sat in the silence of the cabin until the fire needed tending. Tomorrow, she would sit across from the man who had erased her from her own life and tell him, to his face, what he had left behind. She did not know whether her voice would hold. She did not know whether her hands would shake. She only knew that she was done being silent. And sometimes, that is enough. The morning of the meeting, Lenore woke earlier than usual. She made coffee, real coffee, from a bag Boyd had brought her the week before. She stood on the porch in the cool August air and watched the mist settle in the valley below. The garden was at its fullest. The beans were heavy on the vines. The herbs were thick and fragrant. The apple tree was bending under the weight of fruit she would turn into preserves over the next month. She went inside, put on her cardigan, the same one she had worn the day she left Birchwood Lane, and picked up the folder Judson had prepared. She looked at the cabin one more time before closing the door. Then she walked down the path to meet Delia's truck at the bottom of the hill. The meeting was held in the small conference room at the Harwick Town Hall, a wood-paneled room with fluorescent lights, a long table, and 8 chairs that had been there since the building was renovated in 1987. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee from the machine in the hallway. Colton arrived first with his attorney, a man named Prescott from Burlington who wore a charcoal suit and carried a briefcase that probably cost more than everything on Lenore's roadside table combined. Colton sat at the far end, his posture straight, his cuffs adjusted, his expression composed. He looked the same as he had the day he stood on the curb outside the house on Birchwood Lane. Controlled. Certain. But there were differences. His face was thinner. The skin around his eyes had loosened. His shoes, though polished, were not new. And when he reached for the glass of water in front of him, his hand was not entirely steady. Lenore arrived with Judson. She wore the cardigan, a clean blouse, and the reading glasses she needed for documents. She carried a folder containing the property records, her mother's letter, and Nora's sworn statement. She did not carry the notebooks. Those were not for this room. Those were hers. Behind her, uninvited but present, sat Delia Pruitt, Boyd Kessler, and Nora Clement. They had not been asked to come. They had simply arrived, the way people arrive when someone they respect is about to face something difficult. Delia sat with her arms crossed and her work boots planted flat on the floor. Boyd sat with his hands folded, his expression calm and watchful. Nora had her glasses on and a second folder on her lap, just in case. Prescott opened by laying out Colton's claim. The property should have been disclosed during divorce proceedings. The mineral rights represented marital assets. The failure to include them constituted grounds for a revised settlement. He spoke for 12 minutes. His language was precise. He cited case law. He referenced precedent. He spoke the way lawyers speak when they know their argument is thin, but hope the volume will compensate. When he finished, Judson responded in 4 sentences. The property was inherited before the marriage. It was never commingled with marital assets. It was recorded under Mrs. Ashford's maiden name and has remained so for over 40 years. There is no legal basis for this claim, and I believe Mr. Prescott is aware of that. Prescott did not argue the point. He looked at Colton. Colton looked at Lenore. "This isn't about the law," Colton said. His voice was quieter than Prescott's, and for that reason it carried more weight. "This is about what's fair." Lenore looked at him. "Fair," she repeated. "I spent 42 years providing for this family. I built that house. I paid the mortgage. I handled the finances. And now you're sitting on a property worth more than everything I have left, and you're telling me I have no claim to any of it." Lenore was quiet for a moment. She did not look at Judson. She did not look at the folder. She looked at Colton, at the man she had married when she was 28, at the man who had planned her erasure for 2 years and executed it in an afternoon, at the man who was now sitting across a table in a town he had never heard of, asking for fairness from a woman he had offered none. "You took the house," she said. "You took the car. You took the savings account. You took 42 years of my life and packed them into 2 suitcases. You stood on the sidewalk and told me to go to a facility." Colton's jaw tightened. "You planned the divorce for 2 years before you told me. You moved money. You hired lawyers. You did it all behind my back, while I was still cooking your meals and washing your clothes and believing that the life we had was real." The room was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who wish they were elsewhere. The attentive silence of people who are hearing something that needs to be heard. "And now you come here," Lenore continued, her voice steady, not raised, not breaking. "Because you lost the house. You lost it because the taxes were more than you expected, and the agent you hired did not do what he promised. You lost the savings because you invested poorly. You come here not because you miss me, not because you are sorry. You come here because you have nothing left, and you heard that I have something." Colton opened his mouth. "I am not finished," Lenore said. He closed it. "My mother built this place with her own hands after she was left with nothing. She survived here alone for 20 years. She kept the land in my name because she knew, long before I did, that one day I might need a place to go. A place that was mine. A place no one could take. She placed her hand on the folder but did not open it. The spring, the water rights, the mineral claim. None of that is why I'm here. I am here because this is the first place in 42 years where I've been allowed to be myself. Where people come to me because of what I make, not because of the role I held in someone else's house. She looked at him directly. Her eyes were steady. Her voice did not waver. You took everything you could see, but you left behind what was never yours to own. The room remained silent for a long time, long enough that the hum of the fluorescent lights became audible, long enough that the sound of a car passing on the street outside seemed to come from another world. Prescott leaned toward Colton and whispered something. Colton did not respond. He sat still, looking at the woman sitting in front of him now in a cardigan and reading glasses, with dirt under her fingernails and calluses on her palms, and a folder full of documents that proved she did not need him, had never needed him, had only believed she did. Mrs. Ashford, Prescott said carefully, my client would like to propose a compromise. There is no compromise, Lenore said. The land is mine. The cabin is mine. What I have built here is mine. Your client has no claim, legal or otherwise, and I believe you know that. Prescott looked at his briefcase, then at Colton. He leaned over and said something quietly. Colton did not respond. Prescott straightened his tie, closed his briefcase, and sat back with the posture of a man who has just realized he drove 2 hours to lose. Colton stood up. He did not speak for a moment. He looked around the room, at Delia, sitting with her arms crossed, her eyes not blinking. At Boyd, watching him with calm certainty. At Nora, whose sworn statement sat inside the folder like a wall he could not climb. At Judson, who had not raised his voice once and had not needed to. Then he looked at Lenore. I made a mistake, he said. Yes. More than one. Yes. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. I thought I walked out of that marriage with everything that mattered. He said it almost more to himself than to her. I was wrong. I see that now. Lenore watched him. She did not soften. She did not harden. She simply watched, the way a person watches weather change on the horizon, noting it, not trying to stop it. You should go, Colton. He stood there a moment longer. Then he nodded. He did not argue. He did not make one more request. He put on his coat, buttoned it, and walked toward the door. As he passed Delia, she looked up at him. She's the strongest person I know, Delia said, and you almost missed that entirely. Colton paused. His hand was on the door handle. He did not turn around. Then he pushed the door open and walked out. Through the window, Lenore watched his sedan pull away from the curb. It moved slowly down Main Street, past the library, past the diner, past the general store where Frank had refused to tell him anything. It turned at the end of the road and disappeared behind the row of maples. There was no backward glance. Lenore sat in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else had stood up. Nora put a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture so small and so steady that it carried more weight than any speech. Boyd nodded from across the table. Judson collected his papers and said he would call her next week to close the file. Then it was just Lenore in the empty room. She looked at the folder in front of her. Inside it was her mother's letter, now creased from being read so many times. She did not need to open it again. She knew every word. She stood up, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked out into the late afternoon sunlight. Delia was waiting by her truck. You need a ride up the mountain? That would be nice. They drove in silence. The windows were down and the air smelled like cut hay and warm earth and the last of the summer wildflowers growing along the road. The mountains rose ahead of them, green and steady against a sky that was beginning to turn gold at the edges. When they reached the cabin, Lenore stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment in the clearing. The garden was full. The beans had covered the fence. The mint was blooming. The apple tree behind the cabin was heavy with fruit, its branches bending low over the grass. On the porch, the four mismatched chairs sat against the wall. The bundles of herbs hung from the roof, swaying gently in the evening breeze. The wooden table held a row of jars, each one labeled in her handwriting, each one filled with something she had made. She walked up the steps, opened the door, and went inside. The kitchen was warm from the sun that had been coming through the west window all afternoon. On the counter, a bowl of apples waited to be peeled. On the shelf, the notebooks stood in their row, held upright by the small wooden bookends Boyd had carved for her. Her own notebook lay open on the table, turned to the page where she had been writing that morning. On the kitchen counter, beside the bowl of apples, was a note Delia had left that morning before driving her to town. It read, "Sherilyn called. The weekend market wants to give you a permanent table. Also, Harmon walked up this morning looking for bread. I told him you'd be back by evening. He said he'd wait." Lenore read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside her notebook, between the pages, the way her mother used to keep the things that mattered. She sat down. She picked up her pen. The recipe for apple cinnamon jam, the next batch, the one for late September, was half finished. She had been interrupted that morning. Now she continued. The pen moved across the page, each word appearing slowly, clearly, in handwriting that slanted slightly to the right. The same slant as her mother's. Not because she had copied it, because it had always been there, waiting. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was Elaine calling from Oregon. She did not ask about the meeting. She asked about the garden. She asked whether the apple tree had given enough fruit this year. And then she said quietly, "Mom, I'm coming to visit next month, if that's all right." Lenore closed her eyes and smiled. That would be more than all right. She hung up the phone, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The last light of the day was fading behind the treetops. The dirt road was quiet. No engine sound, no headlights, no trace of anyone who had come and gone. Only the cabin, the garden, the steady sound of a pen on paper, and a life continuing in its own rhythm, built by hand, sustained by will, and belonging entirely to the woman who had chosen it. Nothing more to prove, nothing left to fear. Just the quiet certainty of a person who had learned, at 70 years old, that the most valuable thing in the world is not what someone can take from you. It is what they never thought to look for. If Lenore's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that their worth does not have an expiration date. Leave one word in the comments that describes how you feel right now. Because the best chapters of a life do not always come first. Sometimes they come last. And sometimes they are the ones that matter most.